him 14 years of me being in this parish before he realized that the theologian who was resident in the parish should be called resident theologian. I'm very grateful to everything that Father Hathaway has done for this parish. And have you been here 7 years?
It'll be 7 in June.
7 in June, and this is a great jubilee for our parish, what he has done for our parish, what he has done for now the Basilica has been so momentous. When he asked me to become a resident theologian, I'm like, fine, call me resident theologian. He's like, no, but I want you to do stuff. Like, I'll just go to Mass, Father, that'll be fine. Just let me come to Mass. I promise I'll come to confession. But no, he wants more from me, and God wants more from all of us. And I was reminded of that when he then said, can we form an institute? Would you help with this institute? I said, no, Catholic youth will never go for it. But they did go for it. Catholic U was very kind to kind of give me some time to give to the Basilica to form an institute, which we didn't know what it would be called, but we thought about the needs of our parish and our city, the need to really have a strong intellectual life in our parish, to have lectures, to have cultural events, to bring well-known professors, journalists, lawyers, artists, musicians, writers, over several years to kind of bring some seeds in that can flourish and be planted here and help us to be a light in the city of Alexandria. Whenever you look at beautiful pictures of Alexandria, you can always get a glimpse of our church tower. And that, in my view, is the center of Alexandria. Our church is at the center of Alexandria, and our sanctuary and the altar is at the center of the center. And so we are trying to think about activities that we could bring that would bring us all together in discussion. And the only thing that I really know how to do is lecture, since I'm a professional lecturer. So this is the thing that I can do, but I can also invite people, and you can give me ideas. So please reach out to me if you have ideas for things that would be good for us. We're going to do, we have the esteemed senior editor, Mark Bauerlein, senior editor at First Things, is here with us tonight. Very honored to have Mark Bauerlein with us. He has a new book coming out. Is out, or is coming out?
This week.
It comes out this week with Mary, and it's brilliant. What's it called again? What happened to the dumbest generation?
The dumbest generation grows up.
The dumbest generation grows up. So what happens to a generation that was misformed by educational policy and culture, and what are the consequences? I think we know the answer to that. They're not good, but Mark Bauerlein's going to come and give us a talk this spring. We're also going to have my close and dear friend Sarah Mari come from the New York Post, formerly the New York Post, to come and give a talk. So we'll have some opportunities for that. Most immediately, though, we're going to have starting next month, the beginning of Lent, all through Lent, 7 weeks. We're going to meet once a week here to read Augustine's Confessions together as a Lenten discipline. We'll all give something up for Lent, of course, chocolate or ice cream or whatever you want. But we also should take something on. So we're going to read and listen to our phones and call our for penance. We're going to do this for Jesus. But so please pay attention to the announcements on that when we have our Lenten journey through Augustine's Confessions for 7 weeks, with me giving some guidance, but also just having a good discussion of what Augustine teaches us for the spiritual life. So, with no further ado, I'm going to give a brief introduction of my talk, and then enter into what is a lengthy academic talk. And so I hope that you all were signed up for that tonight. And hopefully we can have a little bit of conversation about it afterwards. So one of my earliest conversations conversations with Father Hathaway about this event, or rather about kicking off the Institute for Faith and Public Culture, was the idea of cult and culture. You know that word culture we use all the time? And the main word there is cult, right? Cult is generative of culture, and we talked a lot about that, this distinction between cult and culture, and especially the relationship between Saint Mary's sacred altar and the culture around us. What is the relationship between our cult is the Eucharistic cult, is the cult of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and how should that cult illumine the city in which we find ourselves? So it was agreed very, very early on that, okay, Pecknold will give a talk on cult and culture, who knows what it will be. So I decided I would write on things I knew about, which is ancient religion and St. Augustine, but then making some connection to our own society, our own civilization, because my basic theological premise is that the sacred fire that my title alludes to is the sacred fire on the sacred altar. The sacred fire is the fire of divine charity, and that is the fire by which we can have a truly social and political culture, which I want us to think about tonight. Okay, in earnest, tonight I will argue that, this is what I teach my students to write, I will argue that every city is religious by nature because the human person and thus human community is naturally, essentially, and unavoidably religious. I want to talk about the religious nature of the city and why we can't avoid that. Such a claim should not be controversial, but because we're tempted to see political culture in a liberal frame, and here I don't mean liberal conservative, I mean liberal like liberal philosophical views for the order of the West. Because we are tempted to see political culture in a liberal frame which pretends to religious neutrality and indifference, it is a claim which I would like to present at greater length than I normally would by dwelling first on the place of religion in the ancient city. By doing that, I think it will become clear that the ancient and thus pre-liberal way of conceiving the city was ineluctably and inarguably religious. So we must never ask whether a city is secular or religious, but rather the only question we must ask is whether the religion of the city is true or false. Examining this question prior to the advent of Christianity gives us some perspective then. It not only helps us to see how foreign liberal ways of conceiving the city is from classical antiquity, but it helps us to understand better the way St. Augustine and the Catholic Church more generally conceived of sacred shrines and altars of Christ, as both having preserved, strengthened, and elevated the sacred bonds even of the ancient city. This matters for how we understand the medieval and liberal orders alike, and I would argue it also matters for how we should understand and oppose various pseudo-religious cultic resettlements currently underway in our own world, and why it is so urgent that we become tireless promoters of a public order cognizant of true religion. Okay, part one. I thought that was the main part. Part one, the ancient city. There's three parts: the ancient city, and then a section on Augustine, and then a section on what are we to do. On the hearth of every ancient Greek and Roman home was kept a small sacred fire. It was the duty of the family, and indeed the father, to keep it lit night and day. As Fustel de Coulanges argued in his 1864 classic study, The Ancient City, on the religious and civil institutions of ancient Greece and Rome, this living flame, or Vesta, the Vesta of the domestic altar, was prior to all the other devotions to the gods, to such a degree that we might even say that the domestic altar was the common cradle of all natural piety. For the human soul was forged in a family, and the family was itself a fit home for the rational, relational, and religious nature of man. The ancients regarded this sacred fire, this Vesta, as chaste and pure. They would talk about it that way. as the wellspring of marriage, okay, of paternal authority, as the wellspring of the happiness of the family, as the fire by which wealth and prosperity and inheritance came. As the family enlarged into other families, expanding associations, and forming a city, it was this same bond of the Vesta, the sacred flame, which was thought about as essential to thinking about the unity between families, and thus of the civic order. It was relevant then to the principles, rules, laws, institutions, and mores of ancient civilization. To extend Fustel's metaphor, we can say that the sacred fire of the hearth should be understood as the city's most interior altar, integral to both the good of every human person and the good of every aspect of life together. Fustel de Grange's point was to show that the ancient domestic religion was something like a constitutive core of society. It was constitutive, of course, of the common good of the family, that which bonded the family together spiritually, and of course bonded them not only horizontally to one another, but to the panoply of divinized ancestors and deities. The religion of the sacred fire, then, in Fustel's account, caused the family to form a single body, both in this life and the next. In this way, we can understand that the ancient family was primarily, this is Fustel's words, primarily a religious rather than a natural association. This is not to say that they had no knowledge of the natural law, no knowledge that a family was natural. They certainly assumed that in various ways. They believed, however, that the unity of the family was something more than natural. For example, ancients believed that every member of a family must be initiated into the sacred rites of domestic religion. A natural son, for example, would be disowned if he renounced this worship, whereas an adopted son would be counted as a real son if he was incorporated into the Vesta, into the heart. A natural son could be disowned because of renunciation of the ancestral worship or the worship of the deities, whereas an adopted son would be counted as real if he were brought in to the worship of the sacred fire. In this sense, Fustel is clear that religion is something constitutive of the bonds of family. Certainly, family was natural. It arises from human nature itself through the union of a man and a woman producing human offspring, for which they're responsible. But the natural, temporal conditions for the existence of a family were not sufficient to bind the family together as one. And I think there's a way in which we can all recognize that. When you have tensions, often the tensions in a family are tensions over not actually seeing the religio the same way, not seeing our worship of God the same way. This is what Fustel is after in the ancient city. The family was natural, but it was spiritually tied together by worship. The common good of the family thus flowed not from the gene pool, he writes, but by the rites of participation in worship. In a similar way, a person also belonged to a city. In his Laws in Book 5, Plato says that the kinship of the city, this is a family word, the kinship of the city depends on the kinship of the domestic gods. In this sense, the foundation of the city is also not nature as such, or the bonds of the city are not nature as such, but the bonds of the city depend on religio, on worship. As these ancient cities developed, other associative bonds, such as blood, would be admitted, but nothing was ever as foundational as religion in Coulanges' account. Even the right of property was an essentially religious idea in the ancient city, for every family required an immovable, stable hearth that belonged to them, that was solely their own and dedicated to the gods. The hearth requires soil. The hearth requires a stable foundation, a upon which to be rested. This is how they think about property rights. You have a right to this piece of soil because your Vesta is lit on that soil. This is what can support the sacred fire, and this is what supports and unites the family. Thus, the walls of a home, Fustel du Collonges writes, are raised around religion. Cicero, the Roman philosopher and statesman, would recognize the same much later when he wrote, "What is there more holy? What is there more carefully fenced around with every description of religious respect than the house? Than the house of each individual citizen." Couldn't even think about the individual citizen without thinking about the family and the Vesta. Here is his altar. Here is his heart. Here are his household gods. Here all his sacred rites, all his religious ceremonies are preserved, Cicero writes. The tomb was similarly conceived as something fixed for worship. Why do we have cemeteries? The tomb is fixed for worship as the claiming of a space of land, of property, which is intelligible for primarily religious reasons. It is thus not only possible to think of religion as the cradle of the family, but of the home, the heart, the home, the tomb, and the city. Moderns are sometimes puzzled by such statements, puzzled by ancient prohibitions against the sale of land. Why can't they just sell the land? Because we fundamentally understand the nature of the ancient city as religious, land even as religious. You can't just buy and sell land. The laws of the hearth were prior to the laws of the city, and those laws were theological through and through. The family was a little society. And the fundamental building block of the city, we Catholics take over this idea of the family as the fundamental unit of society. But that is also a classical ideal. To think of the family as constituted by the religio and controlled by the pater familias, the father. In some ways, Fustel Collonges is ahead of his time because he actually finds a variety of pieces of evidence which show that the father is not the sole authority over the heart. That the mater familias also has an incredible authority over the Vesta. So that the pater familias and the mater familias both have a powerful responsibility for the heart. The father had rights principally because he had duties. We teach that in the Catholic Church too. He had rights because he had duties. And his chief duty was, along with his wife, to work the sacred fire. In Roman law, this meant equal dignity between them. Equal dignity between paterfamilias and materfamilias on the question of who has responsibility for the Vesta. Obviously not everything is equal, but on that they had equity. Everything about the family was thus conceived as divine and ordered to the familial piety to the gods and the ancestors. The obedience of children to their parents and the attachment of parents to their children were regarded as pietas, right? And so was the love of homeland, patria. Ulysses longs to see not simply his country remembered. Ulysses longs to see the flame of his hearth fire. That's what Ulysses longs to see. He longs to see the Vesta, the sacred flame. Ulysses longs to see the flame of his hearth fire because the love of one's homeland is principally and most interiorly the love of religion. As Catholics loved the church, so did the ancients love their homes and the hearth and the domestic altar and how it related to the civic altars and shrines. Their homeland was, in a sense, bounded and bonded together by domestic and civil religion. Fustel de Collonges argues even further that there were other bonds, the bonds of the patricians. A class bond was also religious. The patricians of Rome called the gens, and their plebeian imitators, the gentes, are later developments, in his view, of the domestic religion, so that the classes, that every aristocratic gens and every plebeian gentles had religious duties to perform. They had, in a sense, their own associational vestas to pay tribute to. The ancient city is thus not simply a family of families or associative in nature, but rather the ancient city is seen as itself one integral whole, common good, united by diverse religio, constituted by its worship and piety at every level, familial, class, civic, etc. While it's impossible in the ancient world to join two families into one hearth, Fustel argues that the primitive religion of the ancient city arrived at the religious idea of uniting families by another altar. Uniting families by another altar, which could be common to them without sacrificing their hearth fire. This required raising a new altar, lighting a sacred fire to a god who was greater or allied to, in some sense, lateral to or above the gods of any one household, the god who would bless not just one family, but many families together. This is to say that the religion of the ancient city is one which is not in conflict with the domestic religion, but sees itself as, in a sense, imitating the domestic religion at a higher level. One should also consider the philosophers of a city. The philosophers of a city, the professors of a city, also form their own kind of gens. You could think that in universities per se, but a university is a gens, a class, which has a religious bond, a class bound together not by the worship of ancestors or the worship of the heroes of the city, but by the causes and powers of physical nature, a sort of god of nature, which bound together the philosophers above the hearth, and the city was a kind of natural god. From the primitive Zeus to Plato's one, if you will, there was a hierarchy of ancient religio which ordered civic life, domestic and civic life. There was a sacred fire of the philosopher's speculative vision of the good of the whole cosmos in this sense. And so one can see a kind of cosmic religio which bound together the philosophers. Fustel says that each of these religions of the heart, the city, and the cosmos were copies of each other in different ways, different levels, not competitors to each other. Fustel ends his unsurpassed study with a striking conclusion. All had come from religion. Religion was the absolute master of the ancient social and political system in his view, both, quote, both in public and private life. Quote, the state was a religious community, the king a pontiff, the magistrate a priest, and the law a sacred formula. Where law and politics had become more independent of religion, more forgetful of its origins, as in the late Republic and certainly in the Empire, Fustel argues that this was due not to a structural change, but because their religion itself had lost power. And certainly by the advent of Christianity, it had lost power. Why? With the advent of Christ, Fustel argues that the ancient city was changed forever in how it thought about its own religion. No longer is the city governed necessarily by 1,000 false gods, but now there is the possibility of the worship of one true God above all the gods. On one level, the ancient city ceases to exist with the advent of Christianity because something now can be thought which was not thought before. On another level, the ancient city remains structurally intact. The ancient city remains, even with the advent of Christianity, a city which is still structurally religious at the level of family, city, and cosmos. But now it is possible for the religio of every level to be ordered to the one God. Put differently, the ancient city gives way, eventually, to the medieval city. Not by ceasing to be structurally religious all the way up and down the scale, but by exchanging false religion for the true faith. Instead of worshiping 1,000 false gods, the ancient city was transfigured by gazing upon the one true God, whose essence transcended all space and time, raised high beyond all ancestors, heroes, and the gods of nature. A new kind of unity was conceivable. A new kind of sacred fire could be thought. Now the common good of the family, the city, and the whole cosmos were seen not through the distorted lens of ancestors and pagan gods, but through the illuminating beams of sacred light emanating from the revelation of the God-man. Now the family, the city, and the cosmos could be all seen as integrally united by one. Now the family, city, and cosmos could be each according to their capacities united to the one true mediator and sacrifice, Jesus Christ. This fundamentally and permanently changed Western civilization. It can't be undone. Anybody who talks about post-Christian culture is deluded. There's no such thing. Fundamentally, Christian worship has changed Western civilization in a way that can't be undone. So much so that any attempt to assert that is, in a sense, a parody, a mockery. It cannot help but imitate the master religio of Western civilization. It's important to see what it left intact. Namely, Christianity left intact the sense of the domestic church, for example, domestic religion. It left intact the idea that the city remains religious and that the cosmos remains something which is a principle of our worship and religion. The classic Christian description, of course, of what true religion means to the city comes to us as we turn to the second part of my talk through the works of St. Augustine, primarily Augustine's City of God against the pagans. St. Augustine helps us to think about how the ancient city is transfigured. He grows up between two worlds, one pagan and one Christian. He knows, actually, very well in his own family, the difference between pagan worship and Christian worship. His father, Patrick, Patricius, if you prefer, his Christian mother, Monica. Because of his pagan father, it's very likely that he knew from a very early age the Vesta of pagan Roman religion. Very, very plausible. He will later complain when he's a priest and a bishop of Christians in his own parish who are confused. Christians, he even disciplines his own mother from actually mixing up, pinching a little incense for the pagan gods as well as going to the sacred altar of Christ. So it's this world in which you can almost conceive of the pagan rites and Christian rites passing in the night even of one family. Augustine doesn't think that the family no longer needs a cult, though. He absolutely does. But it needs to be anti-idolatrous. It needs to be true cult. He insists that the domestic and civic bonds will only be strong, will only unite people to eternal blessedness through the true cult. This is why we can think of him not only as the greatest of church fathers, but also as the father of Western civilization. In his own lifetime, prior to his conversion in 387 AD, Augustine was a witness to massive shifts. He was born just a few decades after Constantine had made Catholicism not merely a licit religio, a licensed religion, but the privileged religion of empire. When he was a young boy studying grammar, he very well may have been aware of Emperor Julian's attempts to restore the old pagan rites of Rome. But by the time of his conversion to the faith in Milan, under the authority of the strongly pro-Nicene Bishop Ambrose, he watched Emperor Theodosius crush the remaining pagan shrines, effectively bringing an end to pagan worship in his own lifetime by force of law. When Augustine writes The City of God after the Gothic sack of Rome in 410, many elite Romans returned to the Julian appeal. They returned to this idea that we must go back to the Vesta, we must go back to our gods. They had never accepted the Christianization of the empire from Constantine to Theodosius, and they famously scapegoated the church for Rome's fall, for the decline and fall of Rome. They charged that Rome was falling precisely because Christ and his church had usurped the place of the ancestral fire. Augustine thus writes Magisterial City precisely against the demand to return to the gods of Rome, as the original title reflects, De Civitate Dei contra Paganos, against the pagans. One interpretation of this work, which arises in the modern period of interpretation of Augustine's work, is that Augustine changes everything by introducing the concept of the seculum, the secular. I will not belabor this talk with a survey of Robert Marcus, the great historian who, despite his impressive learning, managed to turn Augustine into John Rawls. But suffice it to say that I think it gets Augustine exactly backwards to see him as the inventor of the secular. Actually, that's not Augustine's interest at all. The seculum is an important concept for Augustine. It means a period of time. That period of time that we have in this world matters to God. Time matters very much to Augustine, but that's not the central invention of Augustine. He's not the inventor of a secular arena which is not religious. That would be very foreign to Augustine. And completely backwards, because the most straightforward reading of Augustine's City, the reading which inspired Charlemagne and many other Christian rulers, was that Augustine re-envisioned the ancient city on the hinge of true and false religion. That was Augustine's great invention, not on the liberal frame of the secular space, which is putatively neutral or agnostic to the question of religious truth. Augustine does have this distinctive understanding of the secular, which is bound up with his doctrine of divine providence, but his great contribution to the Western understanding of the city is how thoroughly religious it is, and how the question of the city is not whether it's religious, but how it's religious. To the chagrin of many Marcus-inspired revisionist attempts to square Augustine with liberal order, Augustine nowhere attempts to show the pagans that they were wrong to constitute themselves religiously. It's embarrassing to liberal Augustinians that he spends so many books of the City of God attending very carefully to Roman religion. So they reliably skip over all those books. It's an embarrassment to liberal Augustinians that Augustine thinks that cult is central to public order, public morality, public life, public culture. There is no secular space which is not always already religious for Augustine. And so they must read him very selectively to make him safe for liberal religious neutrality. We famously associate his name, Augustine's name, with the restless heart. But what is the restless heart? The restless heart is the religious heart. For Augustine, the restless heart is precisely the idea that we are religious creatures, that we're made for God. That's part of our nature. As much as being rational is part of our nature, being religious is an ineluctable, irresistible dimension, being human. We are religious by nature, for our hearts are religiously restless. Our religious nature is irrepressible. It's something integral and intrinsic to our nature as rational and relational beings. So the Augustinian choice for humanity is never about choosing between being religious or not religious. We cannot help but to be religious. There is no choice in the matter. For Augustine, the only question is whether our religion will be true or false. The only question then for the city also is whether the religion of the city will fragment the soul and the city, or will bring unity to the soul and the city. He upholds the Greek and Roman idea that religion is what binds us together. He actually spends a great deal of time on the Roman concept of religio as perfectly compatible with the Catholic view. He even traces unique etymological lineages to prove that religare means something like that which makes people adhere to one another, or to God, or to the gods. Augustine recognizes something that is missing from many accounts of ancient religion, including from still the theologians. He notices that just as the home and the city erect exterior altars at their center, so is there an interior altar in the soul. The soul has an altar. There is an interior altar in the heart of man, and upon it we can make an offering, either to the one true God, or, he says, to demons. This is the fundamental thing, that the interior altar can be profaned or sacralized. And it can only be sacralized by the one true God, and every other kind of offering is diabolical. In his famous account of his own conversion, Augustine refers to exterior acts, his errors and sins, as sacrifices offered to demons on the interior altar of his heart. Augustine is often looked to as one who invents interiority, but such modernizing tales mislead. What Augustine recognizes in our restless desire is that our very souls are religious and sacrificial. We make offerings on a kind of interior hearth fire. We have a Vesta in our heart which cannot be denied. This analogy is apt for understanding that what binds together the soul is the same thing as that which binds together the family. And that which binds together should be the same thing as that which binds together the city and the cosmos. Religion, sacrifice, worship, the philosopher's speculative gaze at the good. These are what orient all of our interior and exterior actions. And the test of religio is whether it gives real integrity to all the dimensions of the good, or whether it fragments the soul, or the family, or the city. Since he lives in a world where pagan shrines abound alongside the shrines of saints and martyrs, it's easier to see that these exterior altars of the city correspond in Augustine's mind to an interior altar of the human soul. In this sense, religion doesn't just go all the way down from the philosophers to the city, to the house, but goes all the way, drills right down into the human heart. Augustine initially responds that during the sack of Rome, pagans and Christians alike found shelter not in pagan shrines, but in the great basilicas of the apostles and martyrs of Jesus Christ. Far from being bad for Rome, Augustine immediately retorts that it is the church alone that really gave Rome sanctuary in its great suffering. Indeed, Augustine argues that Rome's fall is due to a corruption at the most fundamental of altar of religion. It's a fundamental problem of the religion of the soul. But what's happening in the religion of the soul has been shaped and formed by the domestic hearth and by the religion of the city. Rome's problem is at root and at every level a religious problem. So he narrates or re-narrates Rome's history for them from the vantage point of religion. What is it that Rome most admires, adores, and worships? That's religion. How does this shape the public thing, the res publica that is Rome? In this sense, he asks an essentially Socratic or Platonic question. What is the relationship between the soul and the city? And what is the relationship between contemplation, what we think about, how we conceive, and our actions? What we do? What's the relationship between our mental word and our deeds? If Rome seems in dire straits, if its actions are decadent, inclining towards self-destruction, it stands to reason that this has at its root a problem with Roman vision, with Roman worship, with how they see their final end, the final end. It has roots in what orients their interior altars. It's for this reason that he repeatedly uses the word spectare, the word that we would translate as spectacle, but it has that sense of seeing, spectare. Anyone with a passing understanding knows that he's very critical of Augustine, knows that he's very critical of Roman spectacles, right? Of stage plays and fighting in the Colosseum, the games in the Colosseum. These are spectacles, right? Spectare. To which we might nod our heads and say, yeah, the Grammys are really bad in our time. Spectacles. The brutality of the games, the debauchery of the theater, were spectacles, but not like, well, maybe more like it than we think, than the Grammys, but the theater and the games were suffused with religion. When you went to see the stage play, they were in a sense enacting like soap operas between the gods, in which the gods are committing all kinds of immoral acts with each other. And if the gods are committing immoral acts, then certainly the souls of those watching are deformed by that. Similarly with the games, both the games and the theater were not only circuses which entertained and formed the people, but they focused the Roman gaze, the Roman contemplation on the very immorality and authorized the very immorality of the city by way of their theology. Roman theater held up the immorality of the gods as either humorous or tragic, but Augustine said that the Roman soul is deformed by these spectacles not because he's against games or theater, but because he's against how these spectacles shape the soul. Because how they shape the soul then shapes the city. In this sense, consistent with the Platonic insight about men who become like their regimes. Remember, Plato talked about this in the Republic, men who become like their regimes. Now, Augustine wants to talk about men who become like what they gaze upon. Gaze upon porn, you're going to become pornographic. Gaze upon filth, it's going to make you filthy. Or men who are like their gods. We become what we contemplate. Augustine personalizes the effect that Roman spectacle had on him. He went to these games. He went to Roman spectacles. He writes in the second book of the City of God, section 5, when I was a young man, I used to go to sacrilegious shows and entertainments. I watched the antics of madmen. I listened to singing boys. I thoroughly enjoyed the most degrading spectacles put on in honor of the gods and the goddesses, in honor of the heavenly Bracynthia, mother of all, so on. Augustine knows Roman worship from the inside. He knows the pagan gaze from experience and recalls the verbal and sexual obscenities performed in his city. The goddess cults demanded that men castrate themselves, sometimes with rocks, in order to serve the altar of fertility, ironically. Priestesses performed sexually degrading rites in public. In a domestic context, they would be unacceptable. And yet, in the public square, people gathered around to watch priestesses do things which are rightfully called pornographic. He asks, who could fail to realize what kind of spirits they are who impel the soul to enjoy such obscenities? The gods of the theater and the city are not friends of the interior altar of the soul. They are not friends of Rome either. Only someone who refused to recognize that these spectacles were created by unclean spirits, Augustine writes, who refused to recognize that these spirits of public culture are masquerading as gods, deceiving men into thinking that the Roman soul was directed by a depraved cult. This notion of spectacle is critical for understanding Augustine's civic, religious argument in the City of God. It's the foundation of Christian civilization. Elite Romans were often not as attached to the gods as the people of Rome. This is true, even though they regarded the gods as sort of functionally essential to the glory of Rome. Some Roman elites held an attitude not dissimilar from Plato's noble lie, the view that there were no actual gods, but they served a kind of pedagogical social function, or they were useful for binding a diverse and far-flung empire. Augustine asked these sophisticates, these tolerant Roman elites that think religion's okay to save the masses. He asked them why they tolerate having, quote, temples to demons, where the Galli are mutilated, eunuchs are consecrated, madmen gash themselves, and every other kind of cruelty or perversion. End quote. The gods and the plays, which were largely about them, had a hold on the public imagination. Romans are captivated by spectacles which spout lies, cruelties, and obscenities, which are all intimately ordered religiously. Their souls have become like their religion, in Augustine's argument. So why does it not occur, he asks, why does it not occur to Roman elites that the problem might not be Christianity, but might be pagan religion? Might be a problem with Rome's own gods, who, in his view, are nothing other than human inventions puffed up by demons. Augustine commends them to read Plato. At least Plato got the one right. He had at least the good sense to banish poets from his city to prevent their misleading the citizens. The divinity of the gods who demand stage plays in their honor. Augustine's point could not be clearer. Spectacles. Spectacles direct the Roman soul, and the most depraved desires of the human heart are given a kind of divine authority, a kind of theological approval. A bad religion has been set up in the city, and it was corrupting the Roman soul as well as the city. He cites their own, quote, best men on this point to ensure that they know that the critique isn't just coming from the outside, the calls coming from within. Augustine cites Sallust on the moral deterioration he witnessed after the civil wars between the plebs and the paupers, noting that after that time the degradation of traditional morality ceased to be a gradual decline and became a torrential downhill rush. Sound familiar? The young were so corrupted by luxury and greed, he writes, that it was justly observed that a generation had arisen which could neither keep its own property or allow others to keep theirs. Sound familiar? Augustine reminds his readers that the corruption that was deteriorating Rome had nothing to do with Christianity. Romans sunk into a morass of moral degradation before the coming of the heavenly King. For all of this happened not only before Christ had begun to teach in the flesh, but before he had been born of a virgin. The bishop will not allow the Roman elites the luxury of blaming their decline on Christianity. He forces them to face their history squarely. In this sense, Augustine is not only defending the one true faith, but he presents his case in such a way as to see, to show that Rome can only be salvaged by a kind of religious turn. To be really properly Roman, Augustine argued, you need a great purge of the Roman gods, because the Roman gods had not only failed to protect Rome, but had guaranteed this torrential downhill rush into immorality. Augustine rails against the way in which materialism and libertine hedonism in Rome are simply a human performance of the gods' own debauchery. The Romans root their moral code only in consent, Augustine writes, and as Aristotle understood, fused the oligarchic and democratic man into one great tyranny built upon lust. Augustine summarizes radical libertinism thusly: get as rich as you can and let people do whatever they desire as long as there is consent. Sound familiar? Yeah. But consent-based morality develops into a society turned in on itself and tends to punish anyone who speaks for a higher, more transcendent standard. As if speaking for many Christians in our late liberal empire today, Augustine laments that to stand opposed to this bad religion because of the disorder it introduces into the soul and city alike invites only derision, exile, you might say cancellation. He writes, quote, also in Book 2, anyone who disapproves of this kind of happiness should rank as a public enemy. Anyone who attempts to change it or get rid of it should be hustled out of hearing by the freedom-loving majority. He should be kicked out and removed from the land of the living. Augustine was not averse to withering sarcasm. His withering sarcasm, though, has a point. Rome is disordered by bad religion, and he takes it as his task to intellectually dismantle the false gods, but also to propose the true one. Despite his withering criticism of Rome's civic religion, Augustine is not hostile to pre-Christian natural religion. He spends a great deal of time on Roman philosophers like Cicero and, of course, great Plato. Cicero is praised, in fact, at great length by Augustine, praised for directing Rome to the, quote, complete justice, which is the supreme essential for government. Cicero sees that a republic should be bound together by a common sense of what is right, what is just, which is to say a shared view of the good, I even say the common good, bound by the common interests and loves and ends which direct the city. But Cicero laments that instead the republic has fallen far from this standard. Cicero says in Scipio's voice, what remains of that ancient morality which supported the Roman state? We see that it has passed out of use into oblivion, so that far from being cultivated, it does not even enter our minds. We retain the name of the Commonwealth, but we have lost the reality long ago. Sound familiar? There was the fancy picture of the glory of Rome, and then there was the degraded reality, evident to all of Rome's greatest men. By the end of Book 2 of the City of God, Augustine returns to the importance of speculation, the gaze, of the spectacle. He writes that Rome had not been formed by the fancy picture it had of itself, but rather it had been formed by that religion. Augustine ends the second book contrasting that debased gaze to the elevating Christian vision, which raises people up to the glorious city of God and gives them a better picture of what the city should be. If some pagan Roman had furiously queried, do you love Rome? Augustine surely would have said, yes, he loved Rome so much that he wanted it to be free from the polluted powers which bound people to sin and error. Augustine's aim in the whole work, then, is one of purification. To purify and reorient the altars of the city. To reorient the altars of the soul, the heart, the city, to the cleansing sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Just as the soul had an altar of the heart which could serve up food to demons through our evil actions, so could the heart be ordered to the Lord's true sacrifice, and so can the city. The city will have an altar. The only question is which one will it be? My final part is brief. Elevating the city. And I want to reflect a little bit about, sounds familiar, our own time and place. Like Rome, America's fancy picture of itself is also disordered. While we may know many Americans who have lived better than the errant theories undergirding the fancy pictures we have of ourselves, over time people become what they see. Not only at the Grammys. The soul will conform itself to the regime, and if the regime is disordered in its own civic religion, it will disorder souls, conform them to a disordered regime. Today our gaze is directed towards a foul altar. I will put to you in America. We are ruled by a liberal dictatorship which demands of us a most perverse kind of worship. The worship of our own immolation to an inhumanity flown far from God's image. Not just in drag queen story hour, but in all sorts of ways. It is sometimes said that the progressive regime we live under is liturgical or pseudo-religious, or some will even loosely refer to a progressive integralism, though its perversities can integrate nothing good. Nor can it make the good really common to us. The liberal regime only fragments. Thus, we have evidence that it is a false religion in order to deepen it. Even when it uses coercion to integrate by force, we can see its flimsiness, its frustration, its fragmenting power. The progressive regime is the most dangerous sort of religion that Western civilization has seen in a long time, because it deifies sexual transgression as heroic, not only because it sacralizes sterility, not only because it can reproduce ideologically but never physically, but because the progressive religio of the city has erected an altar which is false, which integrates nothing, which scatters and destroys. The good news is that this has exposed something in America. It has exposed the lie that a religiously neutral polity is possible at all. For all of human history, political and social order has restlessly sought religious unity. We have witnessed a historical blip, an anomaly of a couple hundred years that is simply not natural. There are simple things within our own national history that can be recovered in municipal, state, and national laws. We can reclaim blue laws, for example, which are absolutely constitutional, have a long history of legal support. We can make laws which structurally privilege at once God, the family, the need for the worker to have rest. As recently as 2009, a German High Court reasserted the importance of upholding Sunday laws for social, economic, as well as religious reasons. My friend Sarava Mari recently argued in the Wall Street Journal that recovering blue laws can discipline the exhausting demands of capital, which abuse the worker as well as the family. And while not coercing people to go to church, Sunday laws would certainly make the choice for Sabbath much easier. Along with the impulse to recover blue laws, we can recover American blasphemy laws. Those who are most likely to scoff at blasphemy laws are often those most likely to enforce an unwritten set of foul blasphemy laws, which are now more recognizable than ever before. If you offend the pieties and values of the new progressive civic religion, you will be punished, canceled, censored. This is all deeply unjust, not because we should not care about blasphemy, but because religion is toxic. God's the defender falls. The Overton window we need will entail a recovery of anti-blasphemy legislation that protects Christian speech, that discourages profanity against God's holy name. And even if such attempts, bold as they may be, fail, it would clarify, again, the conflict that is really before us. We've tended to see school choice as a libertarian tool for funding schools and not schools. Funding students and not schools, but we should rethink school choice in a way which privileges schools by privileging an understanding of pillars of Western civilization, Greek philosophy, Roman law, Christian religion. We should not only be trying to make toxic critical race theory illegal, as my friend Chris Rufo has been doing, but we should also be fighting against the gods of social justice, winning a kind of victory against sacrilegious shrines. We should legislate in ways which privilege the recovery of opening and closing school days with prayer that recognizes the one true God as the cause and end of all things. We should absolutely recover public processions and public festivals on great Christian feasts, and work to gain city, state, and even national recognition for special days of Christian remembrance. Impossible. If you think it sounds fanciful to do any of those things, which I know you do, if it's fanciful about noticing, I must encourage you, all of us, to think about how a radically minority viewpoint, which arose in the 70s, is now dominant. Absurd things which were thought up in dorm rooms by a tiny minority of transgressive postmodernists in the 1970s. Things that would not have gotten public consent, that would have gotten a minority, 2%, 3% of people. Impossible, you would just say to those 70s hippies. There are now federal laws determining how you live, what you can say, what you can think. My friend and colleague Adrian Vermeule so persuasively has reminded us our political world is far more fluid, far more malleable and susceptible to shaping through intentional action, especially the action of committed political minorities, than the putative realists can conceive at any given time. Though certainly aided by foul spirits, the progressive altar was erected by human hands. It was built up, and it cannot stand on its own. So too was the ancient city restored and elevated by human hands, but human hands helped by the grace of God, which united the altars of the heart and the hearth, the city to the high altar of that purity illumined by the divine charity of Christ. Like Constantine, Theodosius, Charlemagne, and Blessed Karl before us, we must lend our hands and our hope to turn around the altars of our city. And we just have to start in Alexandria. That's enough. As I've argued elsewhere with my friends Gladden Pappen and Sir Rob Moore, we must not be afraid of political action which is predicated upon the ancient wellsprings of classical and Christian speculative vision for political and cultural order. We must not shy from that. Even if there's 1% approval for us, we have to be like those 70s transgressives. We must recognize that our cities simply are religious, and I'll end here. Our most fundamental political conflicts are religious and theological. Thus, Christians who care about their neighbor must not be indifferent to the sacred bonds of the city, but must oppose civic sacrilege and work to reorient the domestic and civic altars to God's heavenly city. As pilgrims with our faces set towards Christ, the bright sun of justice itself, our cause is righteous. We have a great hope, even in this temporal order which is passing away. We have a high calling to order our cities rightly as we pray on earth as it is in heaven.